Welcome to the Random Hour, where circles lead us down the strangest rabbit holes. Tonight, we're digging into a story that changed horror forever. Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. And honestly, I thought this episode was going to be perfect, especially with it being the end of October and with the new Netflix series that just came out, Monstrous, with the Ed Gein story. I mean, it's perfect. So, if you've watched Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or even Silence of the Lambs, you've already met parts of Ed Gein. Now, these characters, Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, they weren't pure fiction. No, they were fragments of one lonely man in Wisconsin whose grief and obsession turned into something monstrous. Now, we're going to start off with a little bit of background and some of Ed's, early life here. So, Ed was born August 27th of 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. His father was George, who was known to be an abusive alcoholic who was also unemployed, and his mother was Augusta. Now, Augusta, she was frantically religious, she was Lutheran, and she preached that all women, essentially, except for herself, of course, were sinful and instruments of the devil. So, with that being said, Ed had a very isolated childhood. Now, thankfully, he did have a brother, okay? He had a brother, Henry. Now, the Gein boys, Ed and Henry, both lived under Augusta's thumb. No friends, no dances, no laughter, just farm work, Bible verses, and fear of hell. Okay, Augusta, she wasn't just strict, right? She was absolute. Everything in that house revolved around her. And for Ed specifically, that devotion would one day become obsession. Now, kind of going into it, kind of going into the difference between like Ed and Henry. So, Ed, he was completely and utterly devoted to his mother, right? She was the sun and the stars to Ed. And he took everything that his mother said like to heart, right? But Henry, he was not so much convinced with Augusta's spearings or sprawlings about women and them being, instruments of the devil and everything like that. He was just not about that, right? He wanted to be more normal. He wanted a girlfriend. He wanted to go out, do things, be a normal human being essentially. And it was known, that around town not many people really liked Augusta. She was not a very well-known she was not a very well-liked citizen of the community. And I do think that did kind of factor in and play into how Ed was raised and how and why he did become what he became. Also with the lack of mental notice and lack of help with his obvious mental disabilities and displays that he portrayed. Now, Ed's father dies in 1940. And when his father dies, Ed barely reacted. Okay, he did not really care. And I mean, that's so to speak, his father was abusive, he was an alcoholic. I mean, he just wasn't all around a good person. But his brother Henry dies in 1944. And this is where it gets a little bit suspicious, right? Because Henry dies in a mysterious brush fire on the farm. And there are whispers around that, that Ed may have had a touch or a hand in Henry's demise here. So, going into where Henry and Ed were both completely different when it came to the thought process on their mother, it is thought that the day of Henry died in this brush fire, that he came to Ed and, tried to convince him that, mother was wrong and that he essentially needs to move on and open his eyes and go out into the world. And Ed just was not about that. He did not like that. He was disrespecting mother. He was not about to have, Henry disrespecting mother. And so it's theorized that, Ed possibly, hit him on the back of the head and essentially blundered him to death and dragged him out into this field and lit this fire, then calling 911 like, oh my God, Henry, he died in this fire and I found him and he's face down and he's just dead. Because it was shown in the police reports that Henry did have, he had some form of blunt force trauma on the back of his head. And if you're gonna die in a fire, like, I don't know about you, but I'm gonna try dying face up, I guess. Like, I'm gonna try dying all the air I can get. I mean, I could maybe face down because then I understand maybe not as much smoke inhalation or something, but regardless, it has been known that the medical examiner that did the autopsy on, well, I can't even say did the autopsy on Henry because he didn't even do an autopsy on Henry. He was just like, yeah, he died from smoke inhalation. Ed was right. It is what it is. And the cops, they didn't put another thought into it. They were just like, you know what? Okay, whatever. That's how Henry died. They just 100% took Ed's word for it and did not take a second look there. Now, Augusta, she dies in 1945, only a year after Henry dies. And when Augusta passes, Ed's world ended. He sealed off her rooms, he left them untouched. I mean, this is where it all essentially began. So, after Augusta died, Ed's life shifted into a slow, spiraling descent. Up to that point, again, Augusta had been everything: his moral compass, his jailer, his god. Without her, Ed was left completely alone on that desolate farm in Plainfield. But instead of moving forward, Ed became trapped. He again sealed off her rooms, he kept them spotless, preserved even, like a shrine. While the rest of the house fell into decay, it was littered with dust, garbage, just filth everywhere. The contrast, it was almost symbolic, right? Because you have Augusta's memory here frozen in perfection, kind of like how Ed saw his mother, because he saw her as perfection, like she was perfect in his eyes, while Ed's own world rotted around him. It kind of mirrored the split inside Ed himself. And slowly, that split gave birth to obsession. So, alone on the farm, Ed, he spent his nights reading pulp magazines, anatomy books, and even stories of cannibals and Nazi experiments. Police, they later found stacks of articles on death rituals and headhunters, a curriculum in human anatomy and horror. Every page brought him closer to one idea. And that was if he couldn't have Augusta back, he could recreate her. And you'll see this too. Like if you've watched the Monstrous series here on Netflix, they'll display that and they'll show. And it has been, thought that Ed went around wearing these masks and dressing up as his mother, so he could pretend to be her and kind of bring her life back into him so that way she could still hold that control and that power over him. And one of the things that we'll also go into is that it is known now as well that Ed was also schizophrenic. With schizophrenia comes auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations. So, not only that, but he was seeing and hearing his mother still in that house long after she passed away. It's even thought that one of the first dead bodies that Ed had in the house with him was, in fact, the body of his own dead mother. And it's thought that he would keep her, up in her room, sitting in a chair, essentially just letting her dead body decay. But he was so out of his mind and just so decrazed that he didn't see it that way. He saw it as his mother. There were police officers that would come to his house to question him about things, and he would even call up and be like, "Mother," knowing she's not going to answer because she is dead. So, late in the late 1940s, after Augusta died, Ed later admitted that he started grave robbing. He began visiting cemeteries, always at night, always alone. He told investigators that he would go into kind of a trance. And in police interviews, right, Ed claimed that he exhumed bodies about 40 times. Though he did say many times he'd come out of the spell like trance halfway through digging and he would stop. Now, did he actually stop? I would say probably not, but who knows? Still, police, they were able to verify at least 10 disturbed graves. Now, when they reopened coffins, they found them empty or missing certain body parts. In some cases, even the entire body was gone. In others, only the head or the torso had been taken. One family reported reopening a loved one's grave only to find the casket filled with random debris where the body should have been. Just think about that. Imagine burying someone you love and then years later learning that their body wasn't resting in peace. It had actually been taken piece by piece instead for someone else's own personal obsession. Now, these weren't just nameless, faceless people, right? These were mothers, daughters, sisters, people whose families thought that they were resting in peace, that they were going to be there for the rest of eternity. And in police report, they also noted Ed's calmness. He wasn't ranting or raving. He was very matter of factly how he told investigators how he dug up these graves, which ones he picked, and what he made. There was no games behind it. Like this, what he was like, yeah, this is what I did, and I don't understand what's wrong with it, essentially. And when he asked why, he said that he was trying to make a woman suit so that he could become his mother. And that phrase stuck in every detective's mind that was there that day. It wasn't lust, it wasn't thrill seeking, it was literal obsession, literal insanity. And Ed Gein's crimes, they weren't driven by passion. They were driven by grief, loneliness, and delusion. Obviously, not condoning into what Ed done, because obviously what Ed done was completely horrifying. But in an aspect, you do kind of feel bad for him and feel bad for just the loneliness and how alone he felt, and that he felt so alone that he literally resorted to digging up dead bodies just so that way he could feel the presence of another person. So, some of the confirmed exhumed graves, there was Eleanor Adams. She was buried in 1951. When her grave was opened, her body was missing. Her remains were later matched to parts found in Ed's house. Some other women were Mabel Everson, Georgia Weckler, and a couple others that came up in connection with missing body parts. Just imagine the horror of these families standing at the edge of a reopened grave, realizing their loved one's body had been taken or cut apart and used to make furniture, belts, bowls, just crazy ass shit. And again, kind of going into Ed's mental state and his motive, Ed told investigators he was not killing for pleasure or for lust. Again, just to go into that, he was not murdering these people or digging up these graves because he found pleasure in it or he found some sort of sexual satisfaction in it. He was literally trying to make a women's suit so he could become his mother. He wanted to be his mom. He was calm, he was polite, he was detached. He described his crimes like chores on a to-do list, like it's something that he did every day, like folding the laundry, doing the dishes. He described it like, yeah, it's just like mopping up my floor because the dog vomited or something, or because my kid spilled something on the ground. It's just normal, natural stuff. His obsession, it wasn't rage. It was that grief that he turned into a ritual. Now, going into how Ed chose his victims. Ed, he wasn't methodical about who he exhumed. He admitted he always chose women who reminded him of Augusta. Strong, middle aged, sometimes widows or mothers. Again, this wasn't random. He wasn't digging up any grave he could find. He was targeting women who fit the mold of the only person he'd ever truly bonded with. And that's what makes this so disturbing. These weren't just corpses to Ed, they were pieces of Augusta, little fragments he could stitch together, hoping to resurrect her. And the thing that does make this truly crazy about the whole Ed Gein case is the fact that he was not like a natural, normal serial killer. Normal people that knew him and that seen him all the time and every day, they did know him as a calm and usually nice gentleman. Yeah, a little weird, a little quirky. Something might be a little bit off with the dude, but he was always kind. Nobody really ever had a bad thing to say about him. I think they could all kind of tell he was a little special. There was something not always right with him. And I honestly think that's why it was so shocking because he was one of the least people that the town would have expected to do something so horrendous like this. Especially because he was very involved in the community and he was around the community a lot. Now, we're going to kind of go into some of the police and community reactions. So, police reports described officers breaking down in tears during the cemetery exhumations. These were small town men. Many personally knew these families, even attended the funerals years earlier. Like, 'cause it was a small community, it was a very small community, it was one of those communities where everybody knew everybody. One officer said, "We weren't just looking at a crime, we were looking at the destruction of trust. Trust that the dead would be left alone." The one thing that you would never expect is to find your husband or your brother or your sister missing from their grave. And for the Plainfield community, that would never heal. The idea that someone they'd known for years, someone who'd fixed farm equipment, babysat for neighbors, even shoveled snow, again, because he was very involved in the community, had been creeping into cemeteries and desecrating graves and turning loved ones into trophies. It was almost too much for them to process. Here's again the part that really gets me is that Ed, he didn't see this as evil. He described his grave robbing as something like a routine chore. Again, something as normal as milking a cow or fixing a roof. He talked about it very matter of factly. Yeah, I dug up the grave and I took her body out and I took her home and, I de-skinned her and I turned her into that lampshade. It's right there. You want to go check it out? It's real nice looking. It is right there. I thought it was beautiful. Looks real perfect sitting right there. Takes a real nice, real ambiance. Right there. When he dug, he was very matter of fact, about when he dug, when he stopped, what he brought home. It was like he was giving instructions on how to plant a garden. And that calmness makes the whole thing worse because it tells us that this wasn't madness in the moment, right? This was a lifestyle, a pattern, a circle of obsession that Ed Gein lived in for years. While everyone else in Plainfield thought he was just a lonely, pretty odd handyman. No, he was a little bit more than just the odd handyman. He was the odd handyman, making the odd lamp fixtures and stuff as well out of human skin. Now, this is where his story gets more terrifying to me than a typical serial killer. Because again, Ed doesn't kill dozens of people, right? He wasn't hunting strangers on the street. He wasn't circling the cemetery. He wasn't like John Wayne Gacy, right? Just dressing up as a clown, trying to abduct people. He was circling the cemetery night after night, robbing the dead in secret. And the part that sticks with me the most, he wasn't ashamed about it. He wasn't hiding it. In interviews, he talked about his creations, the way you or I would talk about a hobby. The line between life and death, reality and fantasy, it was gone. And in that void, Ed created a world where death was just raw material. That's the descent of Ed Gein. Not a sudden plunge, but a slow, steady spiral into a darkness so quiet and ordinary, the whole town of Plainfield never saw it coming. Now, we're not going to say he didn't ever murder anybody because we all do know that there are two confirmed murders that Ed actually admitted to. So the first one was Mary Hogan in 1954. Now, Mary Hogan was described as a loud and brash tavern owner. She disappeared on December 8th of 1954. There was blood covered in her tavern floor. But Mary, she was nowhere to be found. She was just gone, disappeared. Now, Ed joked that she's not missing. He was like, "Oh, she's at my house." Everyone laughed. They all thought, "Oh, yeah, okay, we're dead, whatever." Until years later, when police actually found her remains in his farmhouse, her face preserved in a paper bag. And what makes it crazier is that before this, the police, they actually came to his house to investigate and like interview and ask questions. And he was like very calm, just didn't make it seem like anything would be happening. And the police, they took it. Oh no, Mary, she was a good friend of mine. And no, I don't know. I saw her the other night, but everything was fine. And he even mentioned that Mary had passed, in Chicago, and theorized that maybe she got stuck in with something in her past and maybe that's what happened. And yeah, the police, again, just like his brother Henry, they took it and they were like, okay, yeah, maybe that's what we were thinking too. Maybe something happened, and they didn't really look more into it until years later, again, when they found her remains in his farmhouse. And they were like, well, shit, damn, turns out Mr. Ed really did have her here. He wasn't lying. Now, the second murder was Bernice Worden. And Bernice Worden vanished in November 16th of 1957. It was the first day of deer season. She vanished from her hardware store, and her son, who was actually a deputy sheriff, found blood on the floor, and the last sales slip was written to none other than Mr. Ed Gein for a thing of antifreeze. So that night, police, they were like, okay, obviously this is a little strange. First Mary, now Beatrice, kind of the same manner. We need to go check this out. So that night, police, they searched his farm. And in the shed is where they found Bernice's body, decapitated, hanging upside down, and gutted like a deer. Now, inside the house, again, is where they found Mary Hogan's face, a human skin lampshade, skull bowls, and chairs upholstered in flesh. And we'll go a little bit more into that here in just a few, but it wasn't just murder, right? It was craftsmanship born from madness. Like to him, this was art. So, kind of going into Ed's house of horrors. So, the Gein farmhouse, it looked ordinary from the outside. It was 160 acres of farmland. It was in Plainfield, Wisconsin. But the inside was something else entirely. So, going through the cataloged evidence from police reports, there was a lampshade made from human skin. There were 4 chairs upholstered in human hide. There was a belt of nipples, a box of vulvas, some even painted with lipstick. Again, skulls that were turned into bowls, masks made from human faces. There was a wastebasket made of skin. There were lips attached to window shades, a corset made from a female torso. Again, Mary Hogan's face in the paper bag, and then Bernice Worden's head in a burlap sack. And then again, Bernice's body hanging in the shed. Now, officers described it as a museum of death. Many of them vomited outside. That's just how disgusting it was. And some of them never returned to law enforcement again after that day. Like, they were just so traumatized by it that they just could not do it. They decided that they no longer handle being a police officer. So again, amongst the filth, there was the shrine to Augusta's room, which was spotless. Her Bible was still on the nightstand, her rocking chair perfectly in place. Ed had destroyed everything except her memory. So to him, that room was sacred, and everything else was kind of like a twisted offering. But that room, that room was untouchable. Kind of going more into the women's suit again, Ed admitted he made a women's suit. It was a torso with breasts stitched from skin. He would wear it around the farm, imagining he was Augusta. So he would wear this woman torso with dress, boots, and then he would also wear one of the masks that he made out of the faces. And then, not 100% sure if he got a wig or if he used the hair from one of the exhumed dead bodies. I would imagine he used the hair from the exhumed bodies to create like this wig that he would wear and prance around the farm as his mother Augusta. And this is the horrifying confession that would later inspire Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. And what makes this story so chilling isn't just the gore, it's the normalcy of it. Chairs, lamps, belts, everyday objects turned into relics of horror. The real terror wasn't what Ed made, it was that no one saw it coming. He was the quiet handyman next door. Again, like we said earlier, he made a large impact in the community. He was always around. until that door opened. Now, that's what makes the Gein farmhouse so terrifying to me. Not just the gore, but the way it blurred the lines between normal life and absolute terror. Again, the chairs, the lamps, the basket, things every home has. Ed turned the familiar into the grotesque. The real horror wasn't just the bodies. It was the idea that you could walk into a neighbor's house, sit down in a chair, and not realize that chair was made of someone you once knew. When police entered Ed Gein's farmhouse on November 16th of 1957, they expected to find Bernice Worden. Maybe a clue, maybe a struggle. What they walked into instead was a house that felt less like a home and more like a nightmare museum. And it kind of throws a loop for the setting of the farmhouse because from the outside, the Gein farmhouse looked ordinary, old, withered, again sitting on 160 acres of property in Plainfield, Wisconsin. It looked like your ordinary farmhouse that you would see on a magazine. But once inside, officers realized they weren't in a farmhouse. No, this was a crypt. And the contrast is just crazy from the outside of the farmhouse looking normal, ordinary farmhouse to the inside being that horror and terror museum with body parts and things just straight displayed everywhere. And if you think about it, you can kind of imagine that and see the similarities between that and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And you'll notice like the similarities between the two and how Leatherface was and how Ed Gein was and how they both kind of kept the house and how the house was both in ruins, but there were still parts that were kind of shrine-like and left to show the obscured minds between the two. And just the houses being filled with objects no one should ever see. Like, just think about the time and patience that it takes to do that, to peel skin and to sew it back together and to upholster it with furniture. This wasn't a frenzy. It wasn't chaotic. It was methodical. He was building something, like he was creating his own twisted version of comfort. And I mean, in a way, it was like it was his version of creating art and expressing art in his, twisted and demonic way. And that does kind of make it even worse because it tells us that Ed wasn't killing in the heart of passion. He was literally living in it. He was creating a world that only made sense to him. A few other reactions. So when officers entered the house, they never forgot what they saw. I don't think anyone would. One deputy said it was like stepping into a slaughterhouse where the animals were people. Another officer described vomiting outside in the snow. The images were so shocking that many of the crime scene photos remained sealed for decades, considered too gruesome for public release. And kind of going back into the women's suit, again, Ed later admitted to putting it on, walking around the farm, so that way he could be back in her body and be back in control, essentially. For Ed, it wasn't about glamour or power, it was about obsession. He wanted to be his mother. And it's grotesque, yes, but if you think about it, it's also very tragic because at its core, Ed's House of Horrors wasn't just a place of death, it was a shrine to grief, to everything that he lost. And here's where I can't help but wonder, did Ed Gein even see his victims as people, or were they just raw material for his projects? Now, I know it's kind of disturbing to think about, but there's this chilling logic to it. He didn't kill for thrill or power or lust like many serial killers. He killed to collect, to craft, to fill the void left by his mother's death. And maybe that's what makes Ed Gein scarier than Bundy or Dahmer. He wasn't chasing pleasure. He was trying to build a world that, again, only made sense to him in his mind. A world where death could be preserved, repurposed, even worn so that he could keep Augusta alive in some twisted way. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that's even worse. At least with Bundy or Dahmer, we understood the motive, as sick as it is. But for Ed, it's like stepping into a nightmare where logic doesn't apply, where you can't reason with the monster because the monster is grief itself, wearing a human mask. So, Ed, he did end up being declared legally insane, right? Doctors said he was, again, schizophrenic, delusional, and obsessed with his mother, obviously. He spent decades in state hospitals where he lived quietly until his death in 1984. And even after death, he couldn't escape infamy. His gravestone was stolen piece by piece until it had to be removed entirely. Like, that's just crazy. It's kind of like a flip of the coin there. I mean, right? He was grave robbing people back when he was alive, and now people are grave robbing him. So, I mean, it's an eye for an eye at that point. So, kind of going into the cultural impact of Ed Gein and his infamousy and his murders. Now, Ed Gein didn't have the body count of Bundy or Dahmer, but his legacy is far bigger. Now, inspired Norman Bates, the boy trapped under his mother's control, Leatherface wearing masks of human skin, Buffalo Bill trying to make a woman suit. All of them have Ed's fingerprints. He inspired all of them. He became the blueprint for horror's most iconic villains, the quiet man next door who hides under the unimaginable. And maybe that's why we're still fascinated, because Ed Gein reminds us that evil doesn't always wear fangs or horns. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile. So before we put an end to the show, I do want to kind of go into some lesser known, weird, and chilling facts about Ed Gein here. Ones that go beyond the usual body part furniture that we all know. So the first one is that he claimed he had shrunken heads that were sent to him by a cousin in the Philippines. Now, there was a 16-year-old acquaintance who reported Gein had shrunken heads in his home, claiming they'd come from a cousin who served in the Philippines during World War II. Investigators later determined these weren't souvenirs, but female facial skins carefully removed from corpses and used as masks. And that's kind of how Gein got his masks. Another one is that he used his car to haul bodies, and his car was actually sold and put on a sideshow. So the vehicle, it was a 1949 Ford sedan that Gein used to transport the exhumed corpses and murder victims. And after his arrest, the car was sold at auction for $760. A carnival operator named Bunny Gibson bought it and exhibited it as the Ed Gein Ghoul car and charging people to come and view it. Now, with that, that bizarre afterlife of the vehicle underscores kind of how public fascination with Gein's crimes morphed into roadside horror show attractions. Another fact here is that the farmhouse was burned before it could be a macabre tourist attraction. So, after Gein's arrest, his 155-acre Plainfield farm was appraised at a $4,700 appraisal and scheduled for public auction in March of 1958. Now, on March 20th of 1958, the farmhouse burned down under suspicious circumstances. A fire had been started by a nearby cleaning crew disposing of refuse, and arson was, of course, suspected. Many locals suspecting that the fire was intentional to avoid the house becoming a shrine or a morbid tour shop. And the most chilling of it all, despite the horrifying acts, he was described by locals as mild mannered and courteous. So those who met Gein prior to his arrest described him as polite, shy, isolated, but not visibly monstrous in everyday behavior. His oddness was often masked by his quiet demeanor, teasing out how someone so outwardly harmless farmhand could commit such horrors makes it all that more chilling. A couple other weird facts here about him is as a child, Gein had a growth on his left eyelid, which made him have a lazy eye, and a lesion on his tongue that made his speech slightly odd. And at about age 7 or 8, he witnessed his parents slaughter a hog behind the family store, and it was reported that he experienced an ejaculation at that moment. And his mother, Augusta Gein, would punish him very harshly for any social interactions that he had. Social interactions for Ed and his brother Henry were almost forbidden. Like they were constricted to the farm. They could not leave that farm and socialize with other people. And if they did, they were severely punished for it. Ed Gein's story isn't just about murder, it's about grief, isolation, and obsession left to rot. He blurred the lines between the living and the dead, between devotion and destruction. When we picture monsters, we imagine creatures of the dark, but the real monsters, they're often human. And they're often the people that you least expect. This has been the Random Hour. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying shapes aren't ghosts or demons. They're the circles staring back from the eyes of the people we think we know. Want your story or weird late night thoughts on the show? Tell them here at The Random Hour 2025 at yahoo.com or The Random Hour on Facebook. Tell me your origin story with the weird.